Hey guys, it's John here. It is November 23rd, 2021. It is early in the morning. I have to kind of talk a little quietly so as to not disturb others in the vicinity. And I don't know how much time I will have here to complete this. So I apologize if I sound dozy or dopey. But this is another one of those things I really wanted to talk about. And I'm going to take this opportunity to try and do that. So I hope this works. I want to comment on materialism as a doctrine or philosophy or worldview and discuss how flawed it is. And I'll explain why. Now, first of all, to put this in perspective, if in my experience, if I look back at the generations that preceded me or mine, they, for example, uh, had items or household goods or even appliances. Back in those days, I remember growing up, we had a fridge at our cottage that had functioned for 30 years. Not the most efficient appliance, but it didn't fall apart in 2 or 3 years and need to be replaced. And we also had furniture that they had collected with the intention of passing down to their children and grandchildren. And so the consumerism as we know it didn't really sort of take root until after the Second World War. And as far as I'm concerned, this was kind of a function of the outcome of those historic events. The United States was the only real super powerful country that came out of the turmoil of those years with most of its infrastructure intact. Europe was in ruins, Japan was in ruins, and the United States never had any attack of significance other than Pearl Harbor, really, on its shores. So the U.S. was in a very privileged position after the Second World War. It also had a very powerful creative community in the form of Hollywood and entertainment that was unique to it and its character. So, you have all of these factories and means of production sitting there, which had been producing, materials for the war efforts. And let's not forget that the United States didn't enter the war until well into the war. And so here they have all of this factories and means of production now not needing to be focused on the war effort. And what do? You start producing consumer goods. And you also have Hollywood at your disposal, which in some ways, was kind of like a bit of a propaganda machine. Generally, just understand that prior to, say, the end of the Second World War, consumerism as we understand it today just simply didn't exist. Of course, yes, some people aspired to or dreamt about, being wealthy or privileged, but we didn't really have sort of a global sort of class of celebrities, and people didn't measure themselves as much, based on their material status as they began to, after the war. And so, in my own personal view, I believe that materialism as we are familiar with it and consumerism as we are familiar with it now was a product of the result of the Second World War and the American effort to produce goods and generate business and income, which they did, brilliantly. If we just judge it on its face alone without sort of getting philosophical about it. So time goes on, we move into, the 1950s, which was a roaring period of production. I mean, this is even when, suburbia, this concept that, we could all live like privileged lifestyles outside of rural environments, but not necessarily in the downtown core where there was limited space and opportunity. And the notion that we would utilize our cars to drive everywhere, to get everything we needed whenever we wanted it, all sort of stemmed at this point in time. And fast forward to today, and now we have people basically constantly consuming, most of the products we purchase and have a very limited lifespan and end up in, the garbage within a few years typically. And this has had extremely profound consequences for the biosphere, as well as our mental health. Now, personally, I have always, since I was a child, found something very objectionable about people's fascination with things like the monarchy or celebrities or celebrity culture. It has just always irked me. I find it offensive, and I do because I see people projecting or living vicariously through these people who are glamorous and wealthy and influential and attractive and all that stuff. And I see this as just being extremely materialistic and fundamentally disempowering and glamorous and illusory, right? So, like, what do I care about what a Hollywood celebrity thinks? I mean, don't get me wrong, I love artists. I spent many years, most of my friends were artists and creative people. I like creative people because they are interesting. And, they're intuitive and they're fun. So I'm a creative person myself. But I don't obsess about famous people, things like that. I mean, most of them are just as flawed, if not more so than I am. So why would I want to worship them? I just find something very distasteful about the whole idea. But that is related to and similar to materialism as well, which is where, a lot of people dream and focus on, being wealthy or being, glamorous and all of this stuff, which is just all an illusion, right? It's basically saying to the world that you are incomplete or that you don't love yourself or that you need to be defined by your status or your privilege or your wealth or it's just all seems to me so juvenile. But materialism is in that same sort of category. I'll give you some pragmatic examples. When I was young, I lived completely off grid for a few years in the woods. And I had a little cabin, and it was basically a shack with a wood stove in it. But there were some interesting people around, one in particular who, at the time, and for many years, I considered to be my mentor. He was extremely well educated, multiple degrees, been on the dean's list, a perpetual student, philosophy, but he was also really into esotericism, and so he introduced me to astrology and a whole bunch of other things. And so my rent at that time, this is probably in the early 1980s or early to mid 1980s, my rent was $50 a month for that little shack in the woods. And I'm here in Canada, right? So we have winter and snow and stuff like that. And, I had to carry all my stuff in a wheelbarrow down this, what was it? It's at least a quarter mile through the woods. But anyway, I got by and it was quite easy. So, I didn't actually have to work a lot to survive there. And I would spend evening after evening after evening, and I would just trek through the woods and go visit my friend and hang out at his place and just basically pick his brain. and we would talk about all manner of things. Absolutely fascinating. So hours and hours and hours just talking, trying to understand philosophy and the meaning of life and esoteric aspects of reality. This was a profoundly wonderful experience for a person in their early 20s to have. And because my overhead was so low, I didn't, I only had to work so many hours a month, and then I would have all this other time to read. And I read tons of books. And like I said, had all of these profound conversations. And it was amazing, right? So I did that for several years until I got to a point where I literally said to myself, I could do this for the rest of my life, but so what? you know, I mean, I was very happy, but I reached a point where I realized I needed to be challenged more. So like within a day or two, I packed it all in, moved back to the city. Nonetheless, my point is that most people, on the other hand, are locked into these, 9 to 5 jobs, high stress situations, high stress overhead, mortgages, car loans, credit cards, all this stuff, right? That ends up occupying majority of their time, creates tons of stress and anxiety. And basically they get into a situation where they just have to continue to do this, even if it's not really in their highest good, because they're locked into sort of a form of indentured servitude through their own, free will. And so that's the majority of people. And why? Because they want to have, the McMansion and the cars and, the trips and all of these other material things, I guess, to impress people or to impress themselves or to feel worthy or to have a sense of identity in our materialistic culture. It's all just complete nonsense, right? And it's completely self-inflicted, all of that. So materialism and getting onto the materialistic treadmill can basically rob you of a lifetime of opportunities. But that is what the majority of people do. Now, there's a TEDx video called Why is Life So Hard, I believe. I'm going to link it in the description below. And this was published about 10 years ago by this Vietnamese guy who describes his experience of growing up in an environment where they lived very close to nature and they could supply everything they need for just a small amount of effort and time. He's convinced that he then needs to go to have a better life. He needs to go get an education and pursue a career and do all this other stuff. And so he endeavors to do that, but then at a certain point realizes that he's unhappy. And so he goes back to the lifestyle he grew up with and finds that he has a tremendous amount more freedom than he did, on the treadmill that, most people are on. And when I first saw this, which I believe was around the time it was published, I've shared it many times with people because it really sort of summarizes the illusion and trap of materialism. Now, the other thing about materialism is that it is effectively destroying our planet or our planetary biosphere, at least as we know it, the one that we are dependent upon for our very survival. And that this is irrefutable. It has impacts that are extremely profound. Then we have to also look at who benefits from this philosophy or worldview or paradigm. And it tends to be most of the wealth gets concentrated into the hands of a very few. So as you go up the income scale, there's fewer and fewer and fewer people at the top. It is bad for our mental and physical health. It is bad for our planet. It is literally unsustainable. It could literally lead to the collapse of civilization. And in a worst case scenario, it could literally lead to the extinction of our species. This is not out of the realm of scientific conjecture. This is a fact. So the most important thing is that we have to look at where and how we spend our time. What are we doing? Are we doing what we love? Or are we pursuing ideals that have been bestowed upon us from our environment? And that requires some degrees of self-awareness. I have made the case that I had perhaps some of the most formative experiences that I ever had with very few material resources. So that is not a critical component of success. Also, I will add that back in the 1960s, at least in Canada, You could get a liberal arts degree. Anybody could obtain that for free, essentially. You might have to get a summer job or something to pay for your, some little luxuries or whatever, but anyone could get a basic education who wanted it. Now, of course, people have to go into a lifetime of indentured servitude or debt to obtain a higher level education, and then they have to work for 10 or 15 years or whatever to pay off their student debt in many cases. I have talked to young people who have $150,000 US worth of student debt. Now, these people will literally probably have to work for at least a decade, at least, before they can pay that off. There's like $1 trillion worth of student debt in the US. So this indentured servitude goes hand in hand with materialism. So there are a lot of downsides to it. Many, many. In fact, what could be worse than the end of civilization for humanity? And not having a habitable biosphere for future generations. And so all of the things that go along with that, like, for example, I often hear people critiquing their own state of life based on, how much money they make, or their ability to climb the social ladder or whatever. And all this is just complete and utter nonsense, as from my perspective. Like, to me, the thought of doing something that I don't want to do is extremely distasteful. Like, I would literally rather be poor than spend all my time doing something I hate. But many, many, many people do that. And my argument is that it's completely unnecessary. It helps to have socialized medicine, other things like that we can fall back upon. I don't have that particular problem here in Canada. I realize that in the United States you do, but in most of Europe, your essentials in that regard are more or less covered. In essence, the argument is that materialism is like a deeply flawed religion that people unconsciously subscribe to. Most people just don't even understand or haven't even thought about this. They are just sort of indoctrinated to be on this religion of materialism. And it's not good for them, and it's not good for the planet, and it's not good for anybody else. And I also, again, I'm not, I don't want to place all of the blame on the U.S., but the U.S., through Hollywood and through the culture machines, have kind of indoctrinated a lot of people to think that they need to be on the material treadmill to be of value or of worth. And I think personally that that all has to be sort of undone. Like I said, who benefits from that? Not really the people engaged in it. And so, again, like I said, whenever I see somebody sort of unconsciously promoting the materialistic paradigm, whether it's through giving too much credence or concern to people like celebrities, it irks me for obvious reasons. Now, this whole culture has been kind of exported to the world, and it's just literally unsustainable. That's not debatable. So, how do we resolve this collectively? I don't know, but it's something that's worth thinking about. I think of, if anything that came out of the 20th century, this is the lesson that materialism and consumerism is just, it's unhealthy, and it has to end. I'll leave it at that for now. I'm getting distracted because there's some activity occurring around here early this morning, and I'll have to leave it there. But it's something I think people should think about and comment on. Again, people we really need to have a huge shift in values. But there are a lot of very powerful and deeply entrenched forces who would be existentially threatened by any kind of substantial or meaningful challenge to the status quo. And these forces are not ones that we typically pay attention to. They're not the faces we see on the news every night. How will this play out? Well, time will tell, and perhaps we will find out as we get further into the age of Aquarius.